Although most economists are generally supportive of the forces of trade, they readily admit that trade can cause dislocations and disruptions to an economy. Thus, there will always be political pressure to limit imports. Such steps are known generically as protectionism. This lecture will first review the overall economics of protectionism. That is, what are the economic effects on consumers and producers and the economy as a whole from limiting imports? Then, we'll consider many of the possible arguments for protectionism, along with the reasons that most economists find those arguments less than compelling. So let's start with a definition. Protectionism. Protectionism is the laws or rules that reduce or shut out imports. It's called protectionism because the stated intent of such laws is to protect domestic industries from foreign competition. There are various ways in which one could try and implement protectionism. For example, import quotas put a numerical limit on imports. They say quantitatively how much can be imported. Tariffs are a tax on imports. So you might say that each imported car or something has a 10% tax that's added. Voluntary export restraints are when two countries negotiate and one country agrees to reduce its exports to the other country. Now, such reductions are usually not very voluntary at all. They're sort of negotiated under the threat that if one country doesn't voluntarily reduce its exports, the other country will institute some sort of quota or tariff on imports. In the 1970s and 1980s, the United States went to Japan several times over Japan's steel exports to the United States and negotiated voluntary export restraints on the part of Japan. A final type of protectionism is called a non-tariff barrier. And this is kind of the catch-all category. A non-tariff barrier is a bureaucratic or regulatory barrier which is set up really for the purpose of restricting imports. You could imagine, for example, that maybe France would set up a rule that says all imported Japanese television sets must pass through one town located somewhere in the middle of France and be inspected one at a time. And a rule like that might take a long time, it might impose high costs, and it might act as a way of blocking imported televisions from Japan into France. So it's definitely possible to restrict imports. What are the economics of these kinds of restrictions? Well, protectionism definitely helps the industry that is being protected. No question about it. But consumers are going to pay the costs. Let's think about the situation of the industry that's being protected, first of all. The industry that's being protected doesn't face as much competition from foreign producers. As a result, it can charge higher prices and earn higher profits. Now, this statement should not be in any way controversial. I mean, after all, if the domestic industry couldn't charge higher prices and earn higher profits, then there isn't any point to shutting out the imported products in the first place. If it doesn't have an effect on domestic producers, if it doesn't benefit domestic producers, you might as well just let the imports come in. So it's obviously, ostentatiously true that firms that are protected can earn higher profits and charge higher prices. Well, someone pays those higher prices. Domestic consumers pay those higher prices. Thus, protectionism in economic terms is just a way for a government to provide an indirect subsidy to an industry. It's a set of rules that provide industry with an indirect subsidy, and that subsidy is paid for by higher consumer prices. Now, I've been saying consumer prices, but in some cases, like, say, steel, it might be other firms that are buying the product rather than consumers directly. And in that case, consumers ultimately would pay the higher price as the costs are passed along to them in a competitive marketplace. So overall, protectionism is a way for government to rig the market so that consumers of a certain product will pay more and industry will receive that money. If the government imposed a tax on consumption of a certain good so that everyone who consumed that good had to pay the tax, and the government took that money from consumers and gave it to the industry that produced the good, we would call that a direct subsidy. Through protectionism, Essentially, consumers are forced to pay more so that firms benefit, and so that's an indirect subsidy. But, the two situations are really extremely similar, forcing consumers to pay more so firms can have more money. Now, what are the arguments for why this kind of a subsidy to certain industries might make economic sense? Well, a lot of arguments have been made for protectionism. Some of them are more sensible than others, but let's run through the long list and take them one at a time. Many of the arguments for protectionism are about how it might benefit workers. Now, we need to unpack this a little bit because there are different ways and different issues in the labor market for how imports and the labor market might be interrelated. In particular, there are four possible effects here. One is that somehow imports might affect the total number of jobs. Another is that they might affect the average level of wages. Another is that they might create disruption from changing jobs, even if the total number of jobs is up. And another argument is that it might lead to greater inequality of wages, even if the average wage is up. So we need to sort of unpack those possible ways in which imports could affect jobs and look at them one at a time. Now, there's no question that protectionism is a subsidy that can help jobs within a certain industry. However, there is no reason at all to believe that protectionism increases the overall number of jobs in an economy. There's just zero evidence that international trade diminishes the total number of jobs. The most vivid illustration of this that some of you may have read about or dimly recall was when the North American Free Trade Agreement with Mexico was being discussed in the mid-1990s, the early 1990s. And Ross Perot, who was arguing against the treaty, made a famous comment. He said, "If there's free trade between the United States and Mexico, there would be a giant sucking sound of jobs heading south." Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement passed in 1994. It was followed by 7 of the best years for job growth in U.S. history. The giant sucking sound didn't happen. There's strong economic theory suggesting trade should have very little to do with the overall employment level. Remember from back in the language of Lecture 21 when we talked about unemployment, that unemployment is either cyclical, which means it's tied to recession, or it's the natural rate of unemployment, which is tied to labor market institutions like unemployment benefits and rules about hiring. Either way, this is not about trade. To see the fallacy here, imagine that we just decided to shut out all imports. Would that solve unemployment? Well, of course not. I mean, other countries would retaliate. We would lose export jobs. Other countries wouldn't have U.S. dollars if they couldn't sell here. They couldn't buy exports. And the result at the end of the day would be that probably unemployment and employment would be much the same as before. Protectionism can redistribute jobs. It will certainly help industries that face import competition and hurt those that export, but there's no reason at all to believe that protectionism helps the overall number of jobs. After all, protectionism does not in any direct way address either the natural rate of unemployment or cyclical unemployment. What about protectionism shutting out imports as a way to keep wages high? Well, protectionism is a subsidy to industry. It can certainly help wages in the industry that is being protected. However, that doesn't mean higher wages for the economy as a whole. After all, higher wages in the one industry that's being protected are coming at the cost of higher prices for the good that's being produced for all the rest of the economy. So everyone else is, in effect, able to buy less. Ultimately, wages are going to depend on productivity, as we discussed back in Lecture 7. If trade increases productivity, as I argued that it does, then it will also increase average wages over time. Now, of course, the link between productivity and wages isn't immediate, but over time, productivity is by far the single largest determinant of wages. And if trade helps productivity, as I argued in the previous lecture, it should help average wages too. What about inequality? If we have more protectionism, could we somehow reduce the amount of inequality in the U.S. economy? Well, there's a big dispute over how much the rise in inequality of incomes that happened from the 1970s up into the mid-2000s has been caused by trade. And we talked about this some back in Lecture 16. The consensus seems to be that globalization does contribute somewhat to inequality, but it's not the biggest factor. Technology factors like information and communications technology are more important. So are institutional factors in the labor market, like the reduction in the power of unions, the reduction in minimum wages. Those are all things which have tended to contribute to the inequality of incomes. Globalization is just not the biggest compared to these. The mainstream estimate might be that globalization and more trade has caused something like 1/5 of the increase in inequality that's happened. The underlying issue here is, as we talked about in the previous lecture, that a lot of U.S. trade is with high-wage economies. And so that kind of trade is not going to contribute to inequality all that much. Only maybe 3% of GDP or so represents imports from low-wage economies, like, say, China and India. And that just isn't a big enough share of the entire economy to cause the shift in inequality that we've been observing. Indeed, about 2/3 of the jobs in the U.S. economy really don't compete with trade at all. I mean, if you're a lawyer or you build houses or you provide skilled nursing services, you can't outsource skilled nursing services to another country. They need to be provided in person. So there is inequality, there is an issue there, but trade isn't the main cause, and there are a lot of solutions other than restricting trade. There's also sometimes an argument that trade has contributed to an income gap, a growing gap between the richest and poorest countries of the world. We talked about this back in Lecture 20 on patterns of economic growth around the world. The rich countries of the world in the last century or so have been getting steadily and steadily richer. The poor countries, on the other hand, haven't really made very much progress at all since about 1870, so there's been a divergence in per capita GDP. But the wealth of the rich countries of the world is not built on keeping sub-Saharan Africa poor or India poor or Western China poor. Those places aren't poor because of trade. They aren't even involved in trade. If anything, they're poor because of a lack of trade. This rising gap in world incomes isn't because globalization is harming the poorest countries of the world, but because they aren't participating at all. The leading success stories in economic development, like South Korea and China, have actually used foreign trade as one of their main engines of growth. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and certainly no raving free market economist, said in his speech accepting the Nobel Peace Prize, "The main losers in today's very unequal world are not those who are too exposed to globalization, but those who have been left out." What about other arguments for protectionism? It's sometimes argued that there are certain industries called infant industries that need to be sheltered from foreign competition for a time until they're ready to compete. And in theory, this argument could make sense. Perhaps if you helped an industry get well established and get large economies of scale, it could go out into the world and compete more effectively. But in practice, these infant industries usually become geriatric without ever getting ready to compete. And the economy suffers all along from supporting them. Let me give you a classic example. Brazil in the 1970s decided to start its own computer industry. And because its computer industry could not compete in the world economy, it shut out imported computers and gave lots of other subsidies to its computer industry. Well, by the later part of the 1980s, there was a Brazilian computer industry, but it was about 10 years behind the times, which in computer years is a long time behind the times. This wasn't only a problem for the computer industry. Think of all the other Brazilian industries that use computers, all the banking industries, the finance industries, the industrial uses of computers. And they're all trying to get by and survive in the world economy with computers that are essentially 10 years out of date. So you don't just end up with an outdated and uncompetitive computer industry, which would be bad enough. In effect, Brazil hobbled all of its other industries that would have liked to be using up-to-date computers. That's just a terrible, terrible economic policy. The best example of where infant industry policies have worked to some extent is probably South Korea. The rule there was, when they gave government subsidies to industry, was that if the industry didn't reach a certain level of international sales on a preset timeline, then all the protectionism and other government subsidies were cut off. So there was a hard edge there. And indeed, for certain industries, they did end up cutting off the subsidies. So I would say if you have to have infant industry subsidies, you have to set goals for that industry. You have to say, if those goals aren't met, we're going to cut the subsidy off. And if you don't have the political power to do that, don't start the subsidies in the first place. It's also worth saying for South Korea and some of those other countries in East Asia that the fundamental reason for their economic growth is not infant industry policy. These are countries that have extremely high rates of investment in physical capital. These are countries which have had extremely high rates of investment in human capital and have raised up the educational level of their populations. They've done a great job of going around the world looking for the best technology they could use. And even if you look at countries like Japan and South Korea and you say, okay, they helped infant industries, it's also true that those countries gave even more help to old aging industries like agriculture instead. So when you think about the causes of growth in those countries, the fundamental ideas of more investment in physical and human capital, more use of technology have been just far more important than any infant industry policy. Another concern, another reason for protectionism sometimes, is the concern that foreign producers might have an unfair advantage because their nations have lower environmental standards. This is sometimes referred to as a race to the bottom. The argument is that U.S. firms can't compete with dirty industries abroad because they have lower costs, they have lower environmental standards. And the result would be a race to the bottom with lower environmental standards everywhere as countries seek to compete by having the lowest possible environmental costs. Now, this outcome is unlikely on a number of dimensions. It's unlikely because environmental costs are only a small share of total costs, maybe 2% of the total in a country like the United States. Also, as countries get richer, which is part of what happens from international trade, they tend to make their environments cleaner. Richer countries, after all, have more wealth and more resources to spend on cleaning up their environment. It's dirt-poor countries which say, we can't afford to clean things up. Richer countries are more willing to do so. We talked about in the earlier lecture how the environment in the United States, by and large, has been improving over the last 30 years because of the rules reducing pollution. And empirically, even countries like China and Mexico have been getting cleaner air and water in the last couple of decades rather than dirtier, because as they're richer, it's more cost-effective for them to take on the job of reducing environmental pollution. In fact, multinational producers often lead the way in reducing pollution in other countries, because multinational producers bring with them the pollution control technology that was developed in Europe or in the United States, and they use that pollution control technology in the lower income countries as well. So the notion that reducing trade would clean up the environment seems deeply misguided. Another concern over international trade is the problem of predatory pricing, sometimes called dumping. The definition here is that predatory pricing or dumping is the practice of selling below cost. The idea is that you drive out the competition and then you can charge higher prices in the future. Now, this scenario has been alleged for a lot of competitors coming into the United States, like Japanese companies coming in to sell semiconductor chips or color televisions. This process is anti-competitive in the domestic market. We talked about it in the lecture on anti-competitive practices, where you can't drive out the competition and then try and take over and earn monopoly profits. Now, it's easy to find cases where foreign competitors gave U.S. firms great difficulties or even drove U.S. producers out of business. Color televisions and semiconductors give you examples. But predatory pricing isn't just about driving the domestic producer out of business. There's a second part to the story. And it is difficult or impossible to find a case where foreign firms then were able to raise prices and get monopoly profits. After all, they still had to compete with each other. For example, when Japan took a large share of the world car market and steel market, you didn't see an enormous surge of monopoly profits going to Japanese car and steel producers. Instead, there was a continued decline in their prices. It's often true in the administration of laws against dumping that it's become biased in such a way that any time a domestic firm is hurt by imports, they say, well, that must be dumping, that must be unfair trade. But that's not, economically speaking, what dumping is all about. Dumping has to involve not just hurting the domestic producer, but also earning monopoly profits in the future. And that second part doesn't seem to happen. Without that second part, just saying any time a domestic producer is hurt, it's unfair trade, that's a more or less overt method of just protectionism, raw protectionism. Another argument for protectionism is that it's sometimes claimed that certain products are vital to national security. And since they're so important, we shouldn't be relying on foreign suppliers or importing them from abroad. But the logic of this has always kind of escaped me. Imagine that the vital product is oil, and oil is an essential product to the U.S. economy. Well, if it's so important, certainly it makes more sense to import as much of it as we can now and stockpile it, rather than using up all our domestic resources. I mean, if oil is vital, then why drill America first and use up all of America's oil? Shouldn't we instead try and get all the oil possible from other countries as long as we can and conserve our own vital resources as long as possible? If the vital product is a new technology, surely it makes sense to have the best available technology here. And using that technology helps us learn about it and perhaps be able to produce it in the future. It doesn't make sense to say we're going to deny U.S. soldiers the best possible technology in the world because it's not produced in the United States. You want to use it and get to know about it. Moreover, the national security excuse for restricting imports is just very, very easily abused. Let me give you the two most vivid examples of abuse of this excuse. One is, I'm going to read you some congressional testimony. This is from 1962, and at the time, there was some discussion of whether or not to have import protection to shut out imports of scissors and shears from other countries. So, this is the testimony of B.C. Dushla, and he begins by saying, Mr. Chairman and members of the Committee on Ways and Means, my name is B.C. Dushla. I am Vice President of the Acme Shear Company located in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I appear before this committee as President of the Shears, Scissors, and Manufacture Implement Manufacturers Association. Wow, huh? The only national trade association of domestic manufacturers of scissors and shears. The scissors and shears industry is a distinct industry and should not be confused with the larger industry and flatware industries. This bill could destroy industries such as ours and add to the unemployment problem. We have never requested or suggested that a complete embargo be placed on the import of scissors and shears. All that we have asked for and desire is a fair competitive opportunity, not an advantage. The workers in the domestic scissor and shear industry do not want to become wards of the state. They want to use their skills, which have taken years to develop. These workers are not interested in retraining. Over many years, they have developed a skill they are proud of and want to continue the work they are happy doing. Under the provisions of this bill, it would mean a reduction of at least 20 cents per pair at the retail level for scissors and shears now being retailed at $1 to $1.29 per pair. Manufacturers would be forced to close their doors and discharge their employees. The United States would then become wholly dependent on imported scissors and shears. We cannot understand how it would be in the national interest to permit such a loss. We would lose the skills of employees, the management of the industry, as well as the capital investment in production equipment. In the event of a national emergency, with imports cut off, the United States would be without a source of scissors and shears, basic tools for many industries and trades essential to our defense. The scissor and shear industry is one of the oldest in the world. It was brought to the United States from Germany at the time when the United States needed a new industry, and a scissor and shear industry in particular. Scissors and shears of all sizes and types are used in every school, retail establishment, office, factory, hospital, and home in the United States. Scissors cannot be classified as a luxury, gimmick, or novelty. Scissors are used to separate us from our mothers at birth, to cut our toenails, to trim the leather in our shoes, and used to trim the materials in every piece of clothing that we wear. They're used to cut our fingernails, to trim our mustaches, the hair in our ears and nose, to cut the hair on our heads, even down to the end of the road, when our best suit or dress is cut down the back so the undertaker can dress us for the last ride. Scissors are truly used from birth to death. They are essential to our health, education, and general welfare. I ask you, gentlemen, is this an industry that should be permitted to become extinct in this country? Well, you know something, people? If scissors and shears are vital, then almost everything gets to be vital. In the 1950s, there was a subsidy given to the mohair industry. And the argument for the mohair industry was that there was some mohair in soldiers' uniforms. And if we didn't support our strategic domestic mohair industry, well, our soldiers would practically be naked going into battle. And that subsidy continues on into the 21st century. National security is real, but it's also just such an easily abused argument. Strategic trade is another argument. It refers to the situation where a natural monopoly might exist in a certain industry. And so subsidizing that industry to help it get established and get a jump on potential competitors could make economic sense. Remember, a natural monopoly is the case where a firm has big economies of scale, so that a single firm will naturally dominate the market and smaller firms won't be able to compete. And it might be that there's only room in the world market for 2 or 3 producers. A standard example would be like Boeing and Airbus producing airplanes. In this case, subsidizing the industry to get it established could help it that could make sense. But you could make an economic argument for subsidizing that kind of an industry. Of course, the question is, can politicians choose these specific industries and give them the right subsidies? It's usually much more sensible to have a direct subsidy through taxes, rather than putting the entire burden on consumers of trying to subsidize that particular industry. In short, there are lots and lots of arguments for protectionism. There are lots and lots of arguments for shutting out imports. At the end of the day, I'm not sure any of them make a whole lot of sense. Remember that this is why countries go out and sign international trade agreements. Just because markets are powerful and they provide gains to trade doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy with them. As we discussed way back in Lecture 3, there are always going to be people on the supply side of the market who think the price is too low. They're going to blame competition, and they're going to go out into the political sector and try and reduce the amount of trade and competition. Democracies don't just add up economic gains and losses. They add up votes. It's very possible in many cases that special interests will be able to influence the political process to do things that are not for the good of the whole. When there are concentrated benefits to some specific and identifiable group, like the scissors and shears industry, then the costs are spread out over a very broad group like consumers. It's going to be quite possible for the political industry to say, we're going to focus on giving benefits to the concentrated group, even if we're going to spread out costs over a much, much larger group. We talked about that dynamic back in Lecture 18 in terms of the incentives for good governance in an economy. The result of this is that governments sign trade agreements. They sign agreements that commit themselves to world trade. It's worth remembering that the world economy experienced a sharp decline in international trade during the interwar years of the 20th century, that is, between World War I through the Great Depression up to World War II. And after that time, there was this recognition that the constriction of trade was bad for all. So an agreement was reached, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, called GATT. And in 1995, GATT sort of morphed into the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. There's also a wide range of regional trade agreements. The best known in the United States is probably the NAFTA agreement, but there's also a free trade agreement across Europe. There are many free trade agreements across Latin America and Asia. In fact, some people say that regional trade agreements are almost a kind of a spaghetti bowl of agreements, with all the strands reaching back and forth from one country to another. In general, this pattern of trade agreements has really been quite successful. The typical tariff, that is the tax on imports, was about 40% back in the 1950s. Think of that. The typical product being imported had a 40% tax on it. Now, as you look around the world, the typical product being imported has a tariff of about 4%. The mission of these international trade agreements has also expanded to cover services, to cover environmental issues, labor issues, and it's obviously been controversial. But overall, it has certainly helped the overall momentum toward creating more free trade. Politically, the big reason for these trade treaties is for the government to protect itself from special interest lobbying. Congressmen can say, oh, we would love to help you, you scissors and shears manufacturers. We'd love to help you, but there's this treaty, and we just can't do so. And so it provides sort of cover for politicians. Overall, the lesson is that protectionism is typically an excuse for subsidizing industry, and typically a bad idea. Where there are reasonable concerns, there are almost always methods other than protectionism that will work better to achieve social goals. Let me tell you just what kind of trade fanatic I am. I'm glad for GATT, I'm glad for WTO, but I would advocate that the United States government unilaterally take down all of its remaining barriers to imports coming into the United States. I believe that such a step would benefit the U.S. economy as a whole, and it would benefit the rest of the world economy too.